The galaxy declared humanity slaves, then Earth unleashed its wrath. The hall smelled like burning circuits and cold stone. That is the first thing I remember about the day the galaxy ended humanity's freedom. Not the sound of the gavel. Not the voice of the high speaker reading the decree. It was that smell, sharp, ancient, entirely wrong, drifting through the ventilation shafts of the galactic conclave chamber on the station called Pinnacle Reach, mixing with the recycled air and the faint chemical trace of the atmospheric processors that ran beneath the floor. My name is Yara Osei. At the time, I was the senior attaché to Earth's diplomatic delegation, the youngest person in that room by 11 years, and the only one, as it turned out, who would leave it on her own feet. I had been to Pinnacle Reach 4 times before. It was a massive structure, built by the Vorkai 6,000 years ago and expanded by every member species of the hegemony since then. The walls were layered with the architectural styles of 11 civilizations. Walking through its corridors was like walking through history made solid, every corridor a different era, every chamber a different voice. I used to find it beautiful. Standing in it felt like standing inside something larger and older and more significant than anything a single species could create alone. That morning, for the first time, I found it suffocating. Ambassador Leon Hadley stood at the front of our delegation. He was 63 years old, silver-haired, and had spent 31 years building the bridges that brought humanity into the hegemony's orbit. He had negotiated the original partnership charter. He had walked these halls more times than he could count. He believed, genuinely and deeply, that we were here for a trade renegotiation. That is what the hegemony had told us. Expanded FTL access, revised resource quotas, new colony rights on the outer rim. A routine session. The kind of thing that happened every few years when the economics of interstellar commerce shifted and the numbers needed to be reset. I had read the briefing files the night before and something in the language bothered me. Certain phrases were translated too smoothly, as though extra care had been taken to make the wording sound ordinary. Certain clauses were buried unusually deep, separated from their context by large blocks of procedural language. The document structure felt padded in a way that had no obvious administrative purpose. I mentioned it to Leon over dinner. He listened, nodded, and told me I was likely overthinking it. He said that hegemony legal documents were always dense and that the translation team had been thorough. He smiled kindly, the way experienced people smile at careful younger ones, and we moved on to other topics. He was wrong. I have never held it against him. He was a good man who had spent 3 decades believing in something, and he was in the chamber because he was genuinely committed to making it work. The galaxy should have more people like Leon Hadley in it. It does not always reward them. The chamber filled slowly. I stood behind Leon and watched the representatives arrive. The 7 elder races took their positions on the upper tiers, as they always did, elevated, removed, looking down at the proceedings below with the calm attention of people observing something they have already decided the outcome of. Below them sat the lesser member species. 41 delegations in total, including us. The Sethari, small and still, 3 rows to our left. The Dravith observers, large and heavy-framed, standing at the edges. The Myrith cluster representatives, whose species communicated partly through color shifts in their skin, all sitting in a uniform pale gray that I had never seen them use before. I counted the rows. I counted the hegemony enforcement officers stationed at the perimeter. I counted the exits. There were 3 visible doors and 1 maintenance access panel behind a ventilation column, partially obscured by a carved Vorkai decorative pillar about 12 meters to my left and slightly behind me. I noted it without consciously deciding to. That habit, mapping spaces, identifying non-obvious exits, memorizing floor plans before entering any significant location, had been with me since my first posting and had saved me twice in places I had incorrectly assumed were safe. The high speaker, a Vorkai elder named Grethval, entered last. He moved the way all Vorkai moved in formal settings, deliberately, without hurry, each step a contained statement of authority. He had 4 upper limbs and a voice that resonated at a frequency just low enough to make human chests feel slightly tight, as though the air pressure had shifted. He had been on the Hegemony Council for 40 years. He reached his seat and lowered himself into it with the precision of someone who had performed that exact motion 10,000 times. He did not greet us. He picked up a document and began to read. I will not reproduce the full text of the Edict of Subjugation here. I have read it too many times in the years since. But its core was simple and devastating in the way that simple and devastating things always are: clean, clear, and catastrophic. The Hegemony Council, it stated, had conducted a 9-year species assessment of humanity. This assessment had been conducted under provisions of the Hegemony's Classified Tier Assessment Protocol, a provision that Earth's delegation had not known existed, had not been informed of, and had not consented to. Under the findings of this assessment, humanity was classified as a Grade 0 species. Not a partner. Not a client race. Not a developing member on probationary status. Grade 0. The lowest possible classification in a system with 12 tiers. Grade 0 meant property. Earth and all human colony worlds, 47 inhabited systems, representing a population of 4 billion people across 3 generations of expansion, were hereby reclassified as hegemony resource territories. Human populations would be assessed, catalogued, and assigned to labor functions as determined by the administering elder race assigned to each territory. The FTL fuel codes that powered every human vessel, codes embedded in our drives as part of the original Technical Assistance Agreement signed 17 years earlier, were to be remotely revoked within 72 hours of the edict's reading. Without those codes, our drives would not engage. Without working drives, our ships were not ships. They were pressurized containers floating in space. I heard Leon exhale beside me. It was not a gasp. It was not a cry. It was the precise, specific sound of a man's life's work, 31 years of careful, committed effort, collapsing in a single breath, like a structure whose foundation has been quietly removed for years and has finally run out of reasons to stand. Around the chamber, the lesser member species sat very still. Not one of them looked at our delegation. I watched them not look at us, and I understood immediately what that meant. Some of them had known. Perhaps not all of them, perhaps not in detail, but some of them had known something like this was coming. The Myrith were gray. The Sethari representative, On, was looking at the floor. The Dravith observers were entirely expressionless, which for Dravith, who had very mobile features, was itself an expression. Nobody had warned us. Grethval finished reading. He set the document down on the surface before him with great care, as though it were something valuable. And then he looked directly at our delegation. He looked at us the way you look at something that has been a minor inconvenience and has now been resolved. He said, in perfect translated English, and the fact that he had chosen to speak in our language rather than have it translated was itself a message, a deliberate diminishment: you were never partners. You were applicants. The application has been reviewed. Leon stood. His voice did not shake. Whatever else I can say about that day, I can say that Leon Hatley stood in the chamber and he spoke with complete steadiness, which is a kind of courage I have always respected. He said, "This is a violation of the Partnership Charter. Earth signed under guarantees of sovereign recognition. The tier assessment protocol was not disclosed to us. Any assessment conducted without the knowledge and consent of the assessed party is not valid under galactic legal standard and cannot." "We can," Grethval said. There was nothing sharp in his voice. Nothing harsh. Just finality. We just did. For hegemony enforcement officers moved into the chamber from side entrances. Dravith, heavy-framed, built for physical authority. They wore administrative classification, not combat gear, which told me this had been staged to look routine. 2 of them moved toward our delegation at a measured, deliberate pace. Not running. Walking. The calm of people executing a procedure they had rehearsed. I had roughly 4 seconds. Leon was still speaking. He was citing treaty articles, chapter numbers, precedent cases. He truly believed, in those final seconds, that the weight of signed agreements and established law would stop what was about to happen. He had spent 3 decades in a system where that belief was sometimes true, and it had shaped how he understood the world. In this moment, in this room, on this day, it was not true. The law had been rewritten 20 minutes ago, and we were the subject of the revision. I picked up my data satchel from the floor beside my chair. My hands were steady. I slid the primary chip, the one containing all of our delegation's classified communications, the full technical documentation of our FTL systems, and 3 years of interstellar diplomatic records, out of the satchel's inner pocket and into the lining of my jacket. I pressed it flat against my side. Then I stood, stepped back from the delegation table, and began moving toward the ventilation column. I did not run. Running draws eyes. Running says that something is wrong and that someone knows it and that they are trying to avoid it. I walked with the controlled pace of someone who is moving to a different part of the room for a reason. It took me 11 steps to reach the maintenance access panel. The latch was a simple lever, the kind designed for station maintenance workers who might need to access the ventilation system quickly and without tools. I pressed it with my left hand, pulled the panel open, and stepped inside. I heard, in the instant before the panel closed behind me, the sound of the enforcement officers reaching our delegation table, the scrape of chair legs, Leon's voice cutting off mid-sentence, a low command in Dravith that I did not need to understand. I did not look back. The maintenance shaft was narrow and unlit. I moved through it using memory and touch, feeling the wall seams with my fingertips, counting junctions. Before every diplomatic visit to Pinnacle Reach, I had studied the station's publicly available maintenance schematics as a matter of routine precaution. I had never expected to use that knowledge. I was very glad I had. The shaft smelled of metal and old lubricant and the faint chemical trace of the atmospheric processors below. It was warm. It was completely dark. I moved. It took me 19 minutes to reach the outer docking ring. I found a supply runner, a small automated cargo vessel making a scheduled departure to the relay point near the human colony at Kepler Station. I bypassed its cargo manifest terminal using a tool I was not officially authorized to carry and concealed myself inside a sealed container marked as geological survey equipment. The container was roughly 2 meters long and 1 meter wide. It was cold and dark and it smelled like packing foam and metal. The ship departed 4 minutes later. I lay in that container for 6 hours while the drive hummed and the stars moved outside the hull. I had a data chip pressed against my ribs that contained everything humanity would need to understand what had just happened. I was the only member of our delegation who was not in hegemony custody. People ask me, when they ask about that day, what I felt in those 6 hours. I felt cold. Not afraid. Not angry. Not grief-stricken, though I understood, in an abstract way, that there were things to grieve. I felt cold and clear and very focused, the way I have always felt in the moments when the situation is genuinely serious and everything unnecessary falls away. And underneath all of that, something else. Something I did not have a name for yet. Something quiet and hard and patient, sitting in the back of my thoughts like a door that had just been opened into a room I had not known was there. Later I would understand what it was. It was the moment I stopped thinking of humanity as the galaxy's newest member and started understanding what we actually were. Not what the hegemony thought we were. Not what our own history celebrated. The real thing. The thing underneath the diplomacy and the carefully maintained civility and the 31 years of bridge building. We were an unresolved question. And the hegemony had just forced an answer. The cargo ship hummed. I did not sleep. I planned. 9 months before the Edict of Subjugation was read in the chamber, an analyst named Owen Grant had flagged a pattern in hegemony communications traffic that nobody wanted to hear about. Owen worked in a small office in Nairobi, inside a department called the Interstellar Signal Monitoring Division. The ISMD occupied the 4th floor of an administrative building that had been designed for a different agency and never properly modified. The windows faced a parking structure. The coffee machine on the floor was the oldest in the building and made a sound like a small engine failing each time it was used. Owen had been there for 11 years. He was 41, precise, patient, and so quiet in his working habits that his colleagues sometimes forgot he was in the room. He had flagged his first report 14 months before the edict. Hegemony encrypted traffic volume toward Earth sectors had increased by 340%. The signature of the traffic was not hostile, it contained no weapons coordination protocols, no mobilization patterns, nothing that a standard threat assessment filter would catch. It was administrative. Classification templates. Resource valuation indices. Assessment frameworks. The kind of paperwork that bureaucracies generate when they are organizing something large and systematic. Owen had attached a note to his report. The note said, in his characteristic precise language, that the traffic pattern was consistent with a formal assessment process being conducted on a subject who was not aware they were being assessed. He suggested that someone with hegemony legal expertise review the traffic metadata against known tier assessment protocol signatures. His report was reviewed by 2 department heads and marked as inconclusive. The reasoning in the response was that the traffic volume increase could be attributed to expanded trade coordination, and that the administrative signatures were too generic to draw specific conclusions from. Owen flagged it again 3 months later. He had additional data by then, a 15-month pattern that had become more defined, with new metadata layers that matched, with high confidence, the early-stage signatures of a formal grade assessment. He had found reference documents in publicly accessible hegemony legal archives describing the tier assessment protocol and cross-referenced the traffic patterns against the procedural requirements described in those documents. His second flag was also filed. Owen went back to his desk both times without complaint. He continued watching the numbers. He kept his records. He did not understand why no one was listening, but he had been in this work long enough to know that the question of whether anyone was listening was separate from the question of whether the observation was correct. The observation was correct. He was certain of that. So he kept watching. I did not know about Owen's report until after I reached Earth. I did not know about a great many things I learned in the weeks after I arrived. One of the hardest parts of the period that followed was understanding how much information had existed, scattered across different departments and divisions, that had never been brought together into a picture that anyone could act on. Owen's reports. George Alder's unpublished strategic papers. Lena Cross's theoretical materials research, which had been sitting in an academic archive for 2 years. The pieces had been there. The problem was not that we were blind. The problem was that we had been looking at each piece individually instead of understanding what they formed together. I arrived at Kepler Station 41 hours after leaving Pinnacle Reach. The transport I had taken from the supply runner's relay point was a standard colonial passenger vessel, and I had spent the journey in a passenger berth with the door locked, going through the ship's contents in my head, thinking about what we had and what it meant and what needed to happen next. The station commander was a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Carol Webb. She had received my emergency burst transmission before I arrived and had read it carefully. She met me at the docking bay entrance alone, which told me she understood that the fewer people involved in the first moments of this, the better. She looked at me for a moment. "How many of your delegation got out?" "Just me," I said. She nodded once, precisely, the way people nod when they are processing something terrible and have decided that the processing will have to wait. "Secure channel to Earth is available through the ISMD relay. We can have you connected in about 40 minutes. I am pulling my non-essential personnel into the central hub now." "Good," I said. "Keep them there until we know what the fuel code revocation looks like on the ground." She did not ask why. She just moved. The channel took 47 minutes to establish. When it connected, the voice on the other end was Director Paul Nkosi, head of Earth's Diplomatic Intelligence Bureau. He sounded as though he had been awake for a long time. I spoke for 22 minutes without stopping. I gave him names, dates, direct quotes, the technical summary of the fuel code revocation mechanism as I understood it from the chip documentation, and the full political framework of the edict. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then Paul said, "Are you injured?" "No." "Secure." "For now." 68 hours before the drive codes go dark." He was quiet for a moment. I could hear the specific quality of his silence, not absence of thought but the sound of a very capable mind arranging things very quickly. "We will need 6 hours to convene an emergency council session," he said. "Take them," I said. "But when you convene, tell them this. The hegemony did not make a political decision today. They made an assumption. They assumed we would accept this because every species they have done it to before has accepted it. They have no model for a species that refuses. They have never needed one. What we do in the next 72 hours determines whether they need to build one. What are you recommending?" "I am recommending," I said slowly, "that we give them a reason to need one." There was a third silence. "Come home," Paul said finally. "Come home now." I was back on Earth's surface with 14 hours to spare before the fuel code revocation hit. We landed at the Accra reception facility, and I looked out the viewport at the city below, lights, movement, the ordinary scale of human life going about its ordinary business without knowing yet what had happened in a chamber on a station 40 light-years away. That would change within the hour. The news was already being prepared for release. Paul met me on the landing pad with 2 people I had not expected. Victor Hale, lean and precise, who ran something called the Prometheus Project that I had heard of only in the vaguest terms, carrying a coffee that was clearly not his first of the day. And Dr. Lena Cross, head of theoretical physics at the Johannesburg Advanced Research Institute, who was looking at me with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting for a starting gun. The fuel code algorithm, Victor said, before I had even reached them. You have the full technical documentation. Everything, I said. How quickly can I have it? Right now, I said. Let us walk. We walked. I handed him the chip. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at Lena. How long? I asked. Lena Cross considered for exactly 2 seconds. 10 days. Possibly 9. I stared at her. The hegemony estimated 400 years for any species to independently derive that algorithm. That figure is in their own internal assessment documentation. Lena looked at me with an expression that was entirely calm and faintly, precisely dangerous. The hegemony estimated based on every species they have encountered, she said. They have never encountered a species that spent 2,000 years trying to figure out how to build a better fire, a better wheel, a better engine, a better weapon, a better medicine, and a better version of whatever they built yesterday. They have never encountered a species that failed as spectacularly and as often as we have and kept going anyway. Their estimate assumes a species that is careful. We are not careful. We are determined. Those are very different things. 9 days later, her team cracked the algorithm. That same afternoon, I was in a long meeting room in a different part of the Accra complex, seated across from a man named George Alder. George was 71 years old, had a white beard and a bad knee, and had spent the last decade writing strategic papers on hegemony fleet logistics vulnerabilities that no one had published because nobody wanted to read a paper predicting a conflict that everyone assumed could not happen. When I walked into that room and saw the schematics covering every surface of the table, I stopped. How long have you been working on this? I asked. In my head, about 30 years, he said. On paper, about 6. You never submitted any of it. Parts of it, he said, without bitterness. Nobody wanted it then. Nobody plans for what they are hoping will never happen. He straightened up from the table and looked at me directly. Now they want it. So let us begin. That meeting lasted 16 hours. We stopped twice for food. Nobody left for any other reason. By the end of it, we had the skeleton of a plan that was not a defense plan and was not a revenge plan and was not what the hegemony expected from a grade 0 species that had just been told it was property. It was something the galaxy did not have a word for yet. The day after the algorithm was cracked, Earth went dark. Every outgoing broadcast stopped. Every diplomatic signal went silent. Every routine pulse of communication traffic that had regularly flowed outward from 47 human systems to the wider galaxy simply stopped, as though someone had put their hand over the speaker. We learned later that this silence frightened the hegemony more than any individual action we took in the months that followed. They had prepared for outrage. They had prepared for appeals and protests and desperate attempts at negotiation. They had prepared for the grief of a species that understood it had lost and was looking for a way to make the loss feel less final. They had no preparation for silence. George had suggested it. When a predator cannot hear its target, he said, it becomes nervous. Nervous things make mistakes. And mistakes are what we need. He was right about that, as he was right about most things. We were not afraid. We were focused. And we were building. I want to describe those 6 months in detail, because they are the part of this story that is least understood and most important. People remember the battles. People remember the ships and the fire and the moment the hegemony's forward line broke apart at Verithco. Those things are dramatic, and drama is memorable. But the 6 months before Verithco, the months in the dark, when humanity sat with its drives offline and its broadcasts silent and built the thing that made everything else possible, those are the months that actually determined what happened. Anyone can fight when they are angry enough. What we did in those 6 months required something harder than anger. It required precision. I lived those months inside a facility carved into the granite below the Accra complex. No windows. Recycled air that always smelled faintly of machine oil and strong coffee, a combination I will never be able to smell again without remembering exactly what that time felt like. 412 people from every corner of Earth's science, engineering, military, and analytical institutions, pulled together and given a single shared problem and the specific understanding that the answer to that problem was the most important work any of them had ever done or would ever do. The work was organized around 3 streams. Victor Hale ran the engineering stream. Lena Cross ran the physics stream. George Alder ran the strategy stream. I ran coordination between them and the broader governmental structure that was simultaneously managing the public response, the internal stabilization of human colony worlds, and the diplomatic monitoring of what the hegemony was doing in response to our silence. Victor's stream had cracked the fuel code algorithm in 9 days. What most people do not know is that cracking the algorithm turned out to be the simpler part of the problem. The harder part was what Victor explained to me in the first full briefing after the crack. The dependency is in the hardware, he said. We were standing in the main operations bay, looking at a drive assembly his team had pulled from a standard colony transport. He pointed to a component cluster near the base of the calibration array. When the hegemony provided the original technical assistance for our FTL development, they offered us a compatibility package. We thought it was a standardization tool. It embedded a specific calibration requirement into every drive we built. Our drives were tuned from the beginning to accept only hegemony formatted codes. The lock was not added later. It was part of the foundation. Can we remove it? We already have, he said. For about 60% of the fleet. The other 40% needs hardware modification that takes roughly 3 weeks per vessel class. I stared at him. When did that happen? 4 days after the algorithm was cracked, he said. Once we understood the code structure, reverse engineering the lock mechanism was straightforward engineering. I wanted to be certain before I said the words out loud. And you are certain now? Completely. I stood there for a moment, looking at the drive assembly. So we are not just free of the code dependency, I said. No, Victor said. We are free of the code dependency, and we understand the lock well enough to build drives that never had it. From this point forward, every human vessel we build will run on the common standard. Ours. Nobody else's. He said it without triumph. Just as a fact. The way you state a fact that changes everything without needing to announce that it changes everything. Lena's stream was quieter in its process and, in the end, more consequential in its results. She was not working on the drives. She was working on the armor. The hegemony ship armor was a composite material, layered and dense, rated to withstand every weapons system in the known galaxy. It had been tested against the weapons of 32 different species over 2,000 years. It had never been seriously challenged, partly because it was genuinely excellent engineering, and partly because no species had seriously challenged hegemony military power long enough to learn its limits. Lena's team did not try to build something more powerful than what the armor was rated to stop. That approach would have taken decades. Instead, they looked at what the armor was made of and asked a different question, not what can break it, but what does it not want to encounter? Materials analysis. 6 weeks of it. Every scan and sensor record from every encounter humanity had ever had with a hegemony vessel, diplomatic dockings, routine cargo inspections, the one brief and humiliating military confrontation near the Kepler border 7 years prior. They fed everything through Lena's modeling team. What they found was a resonance frequency. The armor's composite layers, when exposed to a tightly modulated energy pulse at a specific oscillation range, developed internal stress fractures. Not at the surface. Inside the material, between the layers, where standard sensors would not detect them. A single pulse did nothing visible. 3 pulses in sequence caused catastrophic internal delamination, the layers separating from each other along their bonding lines, simultaneously, throughout the entire panel. The armor did not crack. It came apart from within. Lena brought me the report in person. She handed me 12 pages and waited while I read the key section. The hegemony has never tested their armor against this frequency range, she said, when I looked up. It does not occur naturally anywhere in charted space. It has to be deliberately generated at precise modulation, which requires knowing exactly what you are looking for. They have never had a reason to look for it. And we are building the delivery system. 8 weeks, she said. Fitted to forward array mounts on converted vessels. Every ship in the conversion program will carry at least 2 emitters. They will not know what hit them, I said. More precisely, Lena said, they will know something hit them. They will not understand what or why until their engineers examine the wreckage. And by then, the engagement will be over. George Alder's strategy stream was the one that, from the outside, looked most like paperwork. It was, in fact, the most ambitious single planning effort in human history. George was cataloging everything, every vessel, every crew, every piece of modified or modifiable hardware across 47 systems, and building a comprehensive picture of what humanity actually had available as opposed to what its formal military establishment contained. The formal military establishment was modest. The hegemony knew this. It was in the assessment documentation they had filed. Their grade evaluation had included a full inventory of Earth's dedicated military tonnage and concluded it was insufficient to pose a credible threat to any elder race defensive installation. What they had not catalogued was everything else. 140 years of commercial and scientific expansion into space. Cargo haulers built for heavy loads and long distances. Mining rigs designed to operate in extreme conditions with minimal maintenance. Deep space survey vessels built for endurance and equipped with sophisticated sensor packages. Colony transports capable of sustaining large populations across multi-year journeys. Research ships with experimental systems that had never been intended for military application but that, when you looked at them with different eyes, had certain useful characteristics. 11,247 vessels. Not all of them viable. Not all of them convertible in the time available. But enough. George showed me the final tally on a night in the third month, spread across the table in his characteristic organized chaos of overlapping documents and hand-drawn diagrams. We will not have a fleet, he said. We will have something they do not have a strategic category for. The hegemony thinks in terms of dedicated military vessels organized in formal engagement structures. Their entire tactical doctrine is built around that assumption. We are going to show up with everything we have ever built, modified by people who understand what they are building it for, crewed by people who have a very specific and personal reason to make it work. He paused. Will it be enough? I asked. Wrong question, he said. The right question is, will they be ready for it? The answer to that question is no. Their doctrine assumes a certain kind of opponent. We are not that kind of opponent. We never have been. The history of human conflict is full of moments where someone told us we could not do something and we did it anyway, not because we had superior resources but because we refused to accept that the rules they were operating by applied to us. He tapped the table once, precisely. Their model of this conflict assumes we will behave like a grade 0 species is supposed to behave, he said. We are going to behave like ourselves. And they have no model for that. In the fourth month, something happened that I did not witness but heard about afterward in full detail from Sandra Obi, a junior analyst in the communications monitoring team who had kept a meticulous record of everything. A hegemony processing fleet arrived at Mars. 7 administrative vessels and 2 escort ships. Their mission, according to the intercepted signal traffic Sandra's team captured, was to conduct the first formal population assessment of a human colony world. The hegemony's official documentation used the phrase, labor inventory initialization. They had come to catalog the people of Mars. They arrived at the standard approach coordinates and went into standard orbital insertion. Mars was empty. Not abandoned, not evacuated in visible distress, simply empty. Every person had been relocated 4 weeks prior under the cover of a declared atmospheric processing emergency. The emergency had been real enough in its staging that the hegemony's intelligence sources, which had been monitoring the situation, reported it as a genuine operational disruption. Nobody had looked past the surface of it because nobody had expected anyone to think that far ahead. The processing fleet held orbit for 11 hours. They sent hailing signals on every standard frequency. They received nothing in response. Then, at the 11-hour mark, a broadcast activated on every frequency the fleet was monitoring. It had been pre-recorded and loaded into an automated system that had been waiting patiently in the station's non-essential systems for exactly this moment. It was 8 seconds long. It said, in Vorkai High Formal, the language the hegemony itself used for all official communications, you woke something that does not go back to sleep. Then silence. Sandra told me that the signal intercepts from the hegemony fleet in the hours after that broadcast were the most anxious administrative communications she had ever processed. They used the word anomalous 47 times in 11 hours. 3 separate reports were filed with the Council flagging the situation as requiring urgent review. The Council's response, which Sandra's team also captured, characterized the evacuation as a primitive avoidance behavior and the broadcast as emotionally generated noise without strategic coherence. They were wrong about that, of course. But their willingness to be wrong about it was itself useful information. It told us that the assumption built into their assessment, that we were frightened and reactive rather than deliberate and patient, was holding even in the face of evidence that should have raised questions. Good. Let them keep the assumption. In the 5th month, Victor's team completed the last of the major conversion retrofits. Lena's emitter systems were fitted and tested. George's deployment geometry was finalized. Sandra's communications team had built, from scratch and with no precedent to work from, an electronic warfare package that could disrupt hegemony sensor networks in a localized area for long enough to matter. I stood in the main operations bay one evening and looked at the lead vessels of what we had built. They did not look like warships. They looked like what they were, human vessels, built for human purposes, carrying tools that had never been intended for what we were about to use them for, crewed by people who understood exactly what was at stake and had chosen to be there. Victor came to stand beside me. "We are ready," he said. It was not a question. I thought about Leon Hadley, standing in that chamber, citing treaty articles to a room that had already made its decision. I thought about the maintenance shaft in the dark and the chip pressed against my ribs. I thought about Grethval's voice, so certain, so entirely unconcerned. "We have been ready," I said, "for longer than they know." 3 days later, Earth went from silence to motion. No announcement. No broadcast. No declaration. We simply moved. On the day we went to Verithko, the hegemony was not watching. That was not luck. George Alder had spent the entire planning period studying the hegemony sensor grid, the vast network of relay stations, automated monitors, and patrol vessels that covered the galactic arm in overlapping arcs of coverage. He had identified the patrol cycles, the sensor refresh windows, the predictable gaps in coverage that existed not because the system had been poorly designed, but because the system had been designed to watch for threats it could imagine. It had no architecture for watching for threats it had not imagined. You cannot build a watch for something you do not believe exists. We moved through the gaps. 14,212 vessels. Or haulers with reinforced hulls and Lena's resonance emitters fitted into their forward mounts. Mining rigs with stripped holds and weapons installations built on principles that were, at their base, 3 centuries old and entirely human. Survey ships with Sandra's electronic warfare packages running in low-power standby. Deep space transports carrying material and crew and the focused attention of people who had a very specific reason to be where they were going. Not all of them were fast. Not all of them were graceful. Some of them were, on any reasonable assessment, impractical as military vessels. But they were crewed by human beings who had spent 6 months preparing for exactly this, and preparation is a multiplier that does not show up in hardware assessments. I commanded the Vanguard from the bridge of a converted deep space freighter named the Reckoning. She had been built to haul ore from the asteroid belt. Her interior was functional rather than comfortable, low ceilings, exposed conduit, a smell of metal and recycled atmosphere that was nothing like the polished facilities of a dedicated military vessel. The crew numbered 41. Every one of them had come from a list of 11,000 applicants. Every one of them knew exactly what we were doing and had chosen to do it. We moved in dark configuration, drives at minimum emission, active sensors off, passive monitoring only. George's gap analysis gave us a transit window of roughly 19 hours from our assembly point to Verithko's outer sensor perimeter. We used 18 of them. Verithko was a gas giant with a dense orbital infrastructure, a massive commercial hub handling the freight and passenger traffic of 37 member worlds. It was not a military installation. It had a defense presence, as all significant hegemony infrastructure did, but its primary purpose was economic. George had identified it as the most strategically effective target available to us that did not require striking a population center. Disable Verithko's function and you disrupt the economic backbone of the hegemony's inner systems without harming a single civilian. We were not there to destroy. We were there to demonstrate. We came out of stealth configuration at the system's outer edge at 0347 station time, when the defense station's duty cycle was at its lowest staffing level. The drop from dark configuration to full active emission happened simultaneously across all 14,000 vessels, in a coordinated sequence that took 4 minutes and 17 seconds to complete. On the defense station sensor panels, 14,000 contacts appeared in 4 minutes. The hegemony's standard response time from contact detection to weapons lock was approximately 6 minutes. George had chosen our emergence point to give them 4. Not to be cruel. Not to be reckless. Because we needed those 4 minutes. We needed every sensor on that station to record exactly what it was looking at. We needed the transmission the station commander sent to the Hegemony Council, and we knew they would send one immediately, to contain a full and accurate account of what had appeared in their system. It did. Sandra's monitoring team captured it 9 minutes after we emerged. The message said, in translated Vorkai High Formal, Human Fleet at Verithko Outer Perimeter. Vessel count ongoing. Cannot establish total. Unknown configuration profile. Cannot establish total. Unknown configuration profile. Good. We fired the first resonance pulse at 4 minutes and 18 seconds after emergence. The target was the heaviest Dravith patrol cruiser moored at Verithka's primary defense dock, a vessel that had been stationed there for 60 years as the cornerstone of the installation's defensive deterrent. The kind of vessel that, in hegemony strategic thinking, represented overwhelming local superiority because nothing in the local operational area was supposed to be able to threaten it. The pulse was invisible. There was no visible beam, no flash, no signature that matched any weapon's discharge in any hegemony threat library. It hit the cruiser's hull and passed through it. 3 seconds later, the hull panel separated along every seam on the ship, simultaneously and completely, from bow to stern. The internal structure was intact. The crew was unhurt. The ship's systems continued to function on emergency power. But the armor, the famous, battle-tested, 2,000-year-old hegemony composite armor, simply came apart. Like something that had been held together by assumption and had just run out of reasons to believe in itself. The defense station went silent for 41 seconds. I was watching the communication channels. Sandra's team had them all open. In those 41 seconds, nothing came from the station. No orders. No all hands. No weapons lock confirmation. Just silence. 41 seconds is an enormous amount of time when you know what you are doing with it. We were already moving. George's approach geometry put us inside the station's weapons arc coverage at the exact angles where the coverage overlapped, and each overlapping zone assumed the other was handling the threat. We moved through the seams. Sandra's teams were running localized sensor disruption around our leading elements, not enough to blind the station completely but enough to introduce uncertainty into their targeting calculations at the moments when certainty was most important. The battle that followed lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. I will not tell you it was clean or simple or without cost. Human vessels were hit. Some badly. Some crew members did not come back, and every one of them had names and people who needed to hear about it afterward, and that weight does not go away and should not go away. The cost was real. But the outcome was what George had planned for. The hegemony's defense force at Verithko, heavier in dedicated military tonnage, supported by a fixed installation, operating on their own ground, was fully neutralized in 2 hours and 14 minutes. Not destroyed. Neutralized. Immobilized. Mission ended. George had been explicit about the distinction from the first day of planning. We were not burning anything down. We were answering a question. When the station commander opened a communication channel to the reckoning, he spoke in standard trade lingua. Not Vorkai High Formal. Trade lingua was the language of equals in the galaxy's economic sphere, the common tongue that no single species owned. It was a small choice and a significant one. He said, "We request cessation of engagement." I said, "Granted. On one condition." He was quiet. I think the fact that I had a condition surprised him more than the battle had. A Grade 0 species was not supposed to have conditions. "Name it," he said. "Open a full broadcast channel to the Hegemony Council. All member systems. I want it active and confirmed before I say anything further. That will take time." "I have time," I said. "Your station is not going anywhere." It took 22 minutes. When the channel opened and Grethval's face appeared on my main display, he looked exactly as I had expected, controlled, composed, and for the first time in my experience of him, uncertain. Not afraid. Not broken. Just uncertain, which was itself something I had never seen him be. I looked at him for a moment. He looked at me. Behind me, at the communications console, a crew member named Daniel Webb, Carol Webb's nephew, who had been on my list of applicants and who had spent the last 6 months working in Sandra's monitoring team, pulled up a recording we had been holding since the 3rd month. It was a Hegemony Council session. The full internal session, from 3 days after the edict. Not a formal record, an actual session, captured by a sensor that had been placed by a member of one of the lesser species who had been in the room, who had watched humanity classified as property, and who had decided, quietly and at considerable personal risk, that this was not the galaxy he wanted to live in. In the recording, a Vorkai senior council member, not Grethval, but one of his colleagues, was speaking about humanity's expected response to the edict. He said, "Their population will protest. There will be noise and some organized resistance in the early months. It will last perhaps 2 years before the economic reality of FTL denial forces compliance. They are very new to the stars. At their core, they are still frightened of them." A pause in the recording. "They are not dangerous," the council member continued. "They are loud and fragile. They are a species that learned to build ships before they learned to understand the galaxy they were flying into. They believed they were partners. That belief made them useful and manageable. Without it, they will grieve, and then they will comply. They always do." I played the full recording on the open channel. Every member system in the hegemony was receiving it. Every lesser species with an active relay connection was receiving it. The fringe worlds that had been quietly watching our silence for 6 months were receiving it. When it ended, I looked at Grethval. "I want you to understand something," I said. "Not as a threat. As a fact. One that should have been obvious from the beginning, if anyone had looked at our history instead of just our resources." I let the silence sit for a moment. "You had 9 years to study us," I said. "You assessed our population numbers and our resource outputs and our travel records and our commercial volumes. You built a complete picture of what we produced and where we went and how much we were worth as a managed labor pool. You were very thorough." Grethval said nothing. "You never read our history," I said. The channel was silent. "We have been fighting each other for 10,000 years, I said. Not because we are broken, not because we failed to develop past it, but because we are constitutionally, fundamentally, irreversibly unwilling to accept conditions we did not choose. We have ended things far older and larger than your hegemony. We have outlasted plagues that should have removed us from the equation. We have survived moments that should have finished us so completely that the word finished should have applied permanently. And every single time something told us that we were done, every single time the evidence suggested that the correct response was to stop, we did not stop." I looked at him. At the face of the men who had stood in that chamber and said, we just did, with the calm of someone who has never had to consider the alternative. "You called us livestock," I said. "Your colleague called us loud and fragile. You built a 9-year case for why we were the safest species in the galaxy to own." I paused. "We have been patient with your assessment. We have demonstrated its error at your largest economic installation using hardware you did not know we had, against armor you believed was invulnerable, through approaches your sensor grid was not designed to detect. We have done this in 2 hours and 14 minutes. I leaned forward. "Revoke the edict," I said. "Publicly. On this channel. Right now. Every member system is watching. Every species that has ever been told it was beneath the hegemony is watching. Revoke it, and we stop. We sit down. We build something different." Grethval looked at me for a long moment. His face was very still. "And if we do not?" he asked. I thought about what to say. I thought about the strategic answer. The calculated one. The answer designed to maximize pressure. I said the honest one. "Then we go home and we build more ships," I said simply, "and we come back with a different question. And you do not want to hear that question. Because you have already seen what we built when we were answering the first one." He stared at me. Then he reached forward, and I heard the sound of a document being drawn toward him. He began to read. He revoked the edict. All 47 systems. All labor inventory protocols. All grade classifications. Revoked, on a full broadcast channel, with every member system listening, in Vorkai High Formal, in the language of authority, in the words that no one in 2,000 years of hegemony history had ever forced the council to say. When he finished reading, the channel was quiet for a moment. Then, from somewhere on the broad spectrum of receiving frequencies, someone began transmitting a response. A single tone. Then others joined it. The Sethari frequency. The Myrith harmonic. Voices from fringe worlds I did not even know had been monitoring the channel. Not cheering. Not celebrating. Just acknowledging. Just saying, we heard this. Good. So did we. 3 weeks after Verithko, I stood again in the Galactic Conclave chamber on Pinnacle Reach. The smell was different. The room had been aired out and cleaned and reorganized, and someone had opened a system of ventilation panels in the upper walls that I had not known existed, and real light was coming through them, not the artificial warm light that the chamber had always operated under, but actual filtered starlight, because the station was positioned near a young star and the panels had simply never been opened before. I do not know whose idea that was. But I appreciated it. The chamber had been reconfigured before I arrived. The upper tiers, the elevated platforms where the elder races had always sat, looking down at the lesser species below, had been dismantled. It was a single level now. Every delegation at the same height. Nobody looking down at anyone. That had been my first and non-negotiable requirement when the hegemony's surviving administrative structure had reached out to discuss what came next. Before agenda. Before framework. Before any discussion of new arrangements. The room comes apart first. They had agreed without argument. I think by that point, argument had become expensive in ways they were not prepared to pay for. The chamber was full. Every species with a hegemony presence had sent a representative. Several species from outside the hegemony's traditional reach had sent observers, some of them traveling significant distances to be present. Word had traveled through the galaxy with a speed that impressed even me, and the species that had been quietly uncomfortable with the hegemony's structure for a long time had been watching us very carefully. They wanted to see what we would do with the moment. That was the question, really. Everyone understood it. The hegemony had used its position to own. We had demonstrated we could not be owned. The galaxy was now watching to see whether, given the opportunity, we would become what had been done to us, or something different. It is the oldest question in the story of power. It just usually does not get asked this directly. Kwame Asante sat to my left. He had been Leon Hadley's deputy and had spent the weeks since the edict coordinating Earth's diplomatic response from Kepler Station with the kind of steady, meticulous commitment that Leon himself would have recognized. He was 47, thoughtful, and had a way of listening to people that made them feel genuinely heard, which is a rarer skill in diplomacy than people assume. Victor Hale sat to my right. Lena Cross was 3 seats down, next to Daniel Webb, who was there because I had told him that the people who built the thing that changed everything deserved to be in the room when the thing was used. George Alder had declined to attend. He had sent a short message saying he was too old for ceremonies and had already started thinking about the next problem. The next problem, he specified, was the long-term structural architecture of whatever replaced the hegemony, and he had notes he wanted to share when I had time. I had the revocation document on the table in front of me. Original copy, formal hegemony parchment, signed by Grethval and every Elder Race Council member. I also had the Edict of Subjugation. I had asked for the original of that document as a condition of the cease engagement agreement and it had been provided without argument. Before the formal session began, I stood up. The chamber went quiet immediately. Not because a presiding officer called for order. Not because protocol demanded it. Because I stood up, and the room went quiet. That was new. In my 4 previous visits to this chamber, the room had been controlled by whoever held the gavel, which had always been a Vorkai hand. Now the room simply paid attention, because the dynamic had changed, and everyone in it understood how and why. I did not give a speech. I had written one. Worked on it for 3 days. Edited it down from 12 minutes to 4. Then put it aside entirely, because when I read it back to myself I could hear that it was for history books, and this moment was not for history books. It was for the people in the room. I picked up the Edict of Subjugation. I tore it in half. Then I tore the halves into quarters. I laid the pieces on the table in front of me. I did not throw them. I did not make a gesture of it. I just set the pieces down, the way you set something down when you are done with it. Then I looked at the room. We are not starting over, I said. Starting over pretends that nothing that happened before this moment counts. It happened. It cost people things they cannot get back. We are going to carry that cost. What we are choosing today is not a clean slate. It is a decision to build something new with full knowledge of what the old thing was. I sat down. Kwame leaned over. That was shorter than I expected. It was enough, I said. It was. The session that followed lasted 11 hours. I will not describe all of it. The procedural details of building a new interstellar framework are not what this is about. What matters is what came out of it and where it came from. The foundational principle of the Galactic Compact was proposed not by Earth, not by any elder race, not by any of the established powers. It was proposed by OWN, the Sethari representative, the small, very still being from a species near the galactic fringe who had been a hegemony member for 300 years and had spent most of that time being treated as a minor administrative footnote. OWN raised their hand early in the session and said, in clear trade lingua, before we build any structure, I would like to propose that we agree on a principle. One sentence. The room gave them the floor. OWN said, no species owns another. 4 words. Not a law. Not a charter article. Not a trade provision or a resource allocation formula. A principle. The kind of statement that is either the foundation of everything or the decoration on top of something that does not actually mean it. The chamber voted on whether to adopt it as the foundational statement before any other agenda item was addressed. The vote was unanimous. Including the elder race representatives. I have thought about that unanimity many times since. What it means that the same elder race council members who had designed and implemented the hegemony's classification system voted without objection for a principle that declared that system wrong at its foundation. Some people have told me it was pragmatic, that they voted yes because they had no practical alternative. Maybe that is true. Maybe some of them voted yes while meaning something complicated by it. But I think something else was also true. I think a structure built on the ability to classify and own other species requires everyone inside it to believe, at some level, that the classification is natural. That things are arranged correctly. That the hierarchy reflects something real about the universe. And when someone demonstrates, plainly and in full view, that it is not natural, that it is a choice that can be made differently, then a great many people who were never comfortable but had no framework for the discomfort suddenly find that they have one. We had given the galaxy a framework. Not by arguing the philosophy. By showing the math. In the months after the Compact's founding session, things moved. Slowly at first, because large things always move slowly at first. Then quickly, because momentum exists in politics as surely as it exists in physics. Species that had been client races under the hegemony joined the Compact because they wanted to. Not because they were offered incentives, though incentives were part of the practical architecture. Because the foundational principle meant something to them and they wanted to be part of a structure that was built on it. Species from outside the hegemony's historical reach sent observers, then delegations, then full membership applications. The fringe worlds, the ones that had been treated for centuries as too small and too distant to matter, turned out to have knowledge and perspective and resources that the Compact genuinely needed and that the hegemony had simply never thought to ask for. Victor Hale's team began working with engineers from 6 other species on the Common Drive Standard, a new FTL specification that was owned by no single species, carried no embedded dependencies, and was freely available to every Compact member. It took 2 years to complete. When it was released, Victor sent me a copy of the technical specification with a short note that said, "For the record, I still have it." Lena Cross published the resonance delamination research openly, as a materials science paper rather than a classified weapons specification. She received correspondence from hegemony engineering teams who acknowledged they had been aware of a theoretical vulnerability in that frequency range for over a century but had dismissed it as practically unachievable. She wrote back, "Most things are unachievable until someone has a specific reason to achieve them." She received no further correspondence from those teams, which I think was its own kind of answer. Owen Grant was given a new position in the Compact's early warning division. He accepted it without fanfare, moved to a slightly larger office, though still without windows, by his preference, and began watching the new traffic patterns. He flagged his first anomaly 3 weeks in. Everyone read the report. The anomaly turned out to be a routing irregularity with a mundane explanation, but the point was that everyone read it, and Owen knew they had, and he went back to his desk and kept watching, which is what Owen Grant did and what Owen Grant was good at, and the compact was better for having him. George Alder, as I have mentioned, did not retire cleanly. He lasted 4 months before Kwame asked him for help with a long-term strategic framework document, and after that he was back at his table of schematics and notes where he was happiest. He worked for 9 more years. When he died, the Compact's Coordination Council held a moment of silence and then, at my suggestion, went immediately back to work. He would have wanted it that way. He had spent his whole life building towards something that worked whether or not he was in the room, and at the end he finally had that. Kwame ran the diplomatic core of the Compact through its first 4 years and shaped its culture in ways that lasted long after he moved on to other work. His approach, patient, precise, genuinely committed to hearing the people across the table, became something like the institutional personality of the Compact's diplomatic staff. Leon Hadley had trained him well. I think Leon would have been glad to know it. I held different roles in different years. Sometimes based on Earth, sometimes at Compact stations, sometimes traveling to systems I had never visited before, working through the specific complicated negotiations that arise when beings who do not fully understand each other are trying to build agreements that serve them all. The work was not always dramatic. Most of it was not. Most of it was meetings and documents and the slow, careful construction of shared frameworks between parties with different histories and different needs and different languages for describing what they wanted. I found that work meaningful. More meaningful, in many ways, than anything I had done before the edict. Because before the edict, diplomacy had been about maintaining a structure that already existed and that I had not examined carefully enough. After, it was about building something that had never existed, and building it with full awareness of what we were trying not to repeat. On the first anniversary of the Compact's founding, there was a ceremony at Pinnacle Reach. Representatives attended from every member species and several observer species. The room was still level. The starlight panels were still open. Owen spoke, as they often did, briefly, clearly, with the quality of attention that made everything they said feel precise. I was asked to speak as well. I thought again about what to say. I thought about Leon Hadley and the treaty articles and the moment the chamber had gone wrong. I thought about the maintenance shaft in the dark and the chip pressed against my ribs and the 6 hours in the cargo container, feeling cold and clear, planning. I thought about Victor saying, "We already have," and Lena saying, "Most things are unachievable," and George saying the second thing is harder and the second thing is the only one that actually solves the problem. I stood at the podium. The room was quiet. A year ago, I said, the galaxy decided what humanity was. We disagreed. That disagreement cost us things, time, safety, the comfortable idea that the structure we were living inside was arranged in good faith. And it turned out that losing those things was the beginning of something we could not have arrived at any other way. Because when you stop assuming the world is arranged correctly, you become very motivated to arrange it better. I paused. We did not win a war, I said. I want to be clear about that. We refused a condition. That is different. Winning a war is about defeating an opponent. Refusing a condition is about defining what you will accept. We defined it. And then, and this is the part that took more work than any of the rest, we chose to use the moment we had created to build something rather than to take something. Because we could have taken things. The leverage was there. The argument for securing permanent advantages was reasonable. Some very smart people made it to me directly. I looked at the room. The full, level, single-tier room. George Alder told me something, 2 days after Verithko, that I have not been able to put down since. He said, "We proved we could not be owned. Now we have to prove we do not want to own." He said those are 2 different things. He said the second one is harder. He said the second one is the only one that actually solves the problem. I stopped for a moment. He was right. He was right in the specific, mathematical way that the best strategic minds are right, not because it sounded good, but because when you follow the logic all the way through, the answer is the answer and you cannot arrive at a different one without making an error somewhere in the chain. I looked at Owen in the third row. They gave me a small, precise nod. We keep building, I said. That is what we do. It is all we have ever done. We fail and we get back up and we build something better, not because we are noble but because we are constitutionally incapable of accepting the version of the world that does not reflect what we think is possible. It is inconvenient. It has caused us enormous problems throughout our history. And it is, in the end, the only thing that has ever actually moved us forward. I stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet. I sat down. Kwame was to my left. He said nothing. He just nodded, once, the same way Carol Webb had nodded when I arrived at Kepler Station with a bruised shoulder and a data chip and 68 hours to change the direction of our species. Outside Pinnacle Reach, the galaxy turned. 47 human systems, and growing. Hundreds of other species, in their own worlds, living their own lives in a structure that was imperfect and contested and alive in the way that only real, built things are alive. Not finished. Not resolved. Not a final answer. A working answer, being worked on. Owen Grant, in his office somewhere, was watching the numbers. Sandra Obi was monitoring the channels. Daniel Webb was in a new posting, doing the careful, patient work of early diplomatic coordination with species that had been on the fringe for so long they had stopped believing anyone would take them seriously. George's notes were on someone's desk, being read. And I was still here, still working, still in the middle of something that did not have an ending because the things that matter do not end. They continue. They evolve. They face new problems and generate new questions and require, again and again, the decision to face those questions honestly instead of filing them somewhere and hoping they go away. We were not going back to sleep. We had never been asleep. We had just been waiting for the galaxy to understand what it was dealing with. Now it knew. And the knowing was only the beginning. End.